Question 1. A company historically placed all applications and databases behind an internal firewall. Employees entered a username and password at the gate, and after passing that gate, they could access everything on the internal network. After a credential theft incident, leadership wants an approach where access decisions are governed by a central policy that protects resources wherever they are located, rather than relying only on the network boundary. Which approach best matches this goal? Select one answer. A. Restrict everything to a secure network and rely on the firewall as the main protection. B. Use a central policy to protect assets anywhere, so access can be controlled even when resources are not behind the same firewall. C. Grant full access to internal resources once a user has successfully entered a username and password one time. D. Stop verifying identity after the first successful sign-in to reduce user friction. The correct answer is B. Use a central policy to protect assets anywhere, so access can be controlled even when resources are not behind the same firewall. Now let me explain. This question is testing the difference between traditional perimeter security and a modern policy-driven approach. B is correct because the goal is to protect applications and data wherever they are located, not only when they sit behind one internal firewall. In a real organization, that matters when systems are spread across on-premises servers, cloud platforms, and remote environments. A is incorrect because it still depends mainly on the firewall as the primary protection. However, leadership wants access control that follows the resource, not protection limited to one network boundary. C is incorrect because it reflects the old model where one successful sign-in can open broad access across the network. Consequently, if credentials are stolen, an attacker may move through multiple internal resources. D is also incorrect because stopping identity verification after the first sign-in reduces security rather than strengthening it. Therefore, the better approach is to keep access governed by central policy controls. So the best answer is B. Use a central policy to protect assets anywhere, so access can be controlled even when resources are not behind the same firewall. Question 2. A company with a hybrid and multi-cloud environment has a mobile workforce and wants security controls that protect people, devices, applications, and data wherever activity occurs. The security team wants a model that assumes compromise and evaluates every access request as though it comes from an uncontrolled network, even if the request originates inside the corporate firewall. Which security model fits this requirement? Select one answer. A. Perimeter trust. Treat anything behind the corporate firewall as safe by default. B. Single sign-on only. Allow access after one successful sign-in without further checks. C. Zero trust. Assume breach and validate every access request regardless of where it originates. D. Network isolation only. Protect resources by limiting all access to a single internal network. The correct answer is C. Zero trust. Assume breach and validate every access request regardless of where it originates. Now let me explain. This question is describing a security model built for hybrid, multi-cloud, and mobile work environments. C is correct because zero trust assumes breach and requires every access request to be validated whether it comes from inside or outside the firewall. In real-world terms, this works well when employees connect from home on mobile devices or through cloud apps because trust is not based only on network location. A is incorrect because perimeter trust treats the internal network as safe by default. However, that does not fit a model that assumes internal requests may also be risky. B is also incorrect because single sign-on by itself only reduces repeated sign-ins. Nevertheless, one successful sign-in without continued validation does not satisfy the requirement to evaluate every request. D is incorrect as well because network isolation alone focuses on keeping resources inside one internal network. Therefore, it does not match the need to protect resources across hybrid and multi-cloud environments wherever they are located. So the best answer is C. Zero trust, assume breach, and validate every access request regardless of where it originates. Question 3. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Security Assertion Markup Language, or SAML, is described as an open standard for exchanging authentication and authorization data between an identity provider and a service provider, and it uses an XML-based markup language for security assertions. Now let me explain. The correct fill is XML-based because SAML is built on XML for exchanging security assertions between identity providers and service providers. This is one of the defining characteristics of SAML in enterprise authentication scenarios. The other possible choices do not fit this description because SAML is not described here as JSON formatted, binary encoded, tokenless, or hardware only. Therefore, XML-based is the correct answer. Question 4. For each external identity's capability description, drag it to the appropriate box in the correct match column to match it against the correct capability type. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. External users sign in to Microsoft applications or other enterprise apps using their preferred identity, and they are represented in your directory, typically as guest users. B2B collaboration. Mutual, two-way trust between Microsoft and Entra organizations for seamless collaboration, supports Teams' shared channels, and users are not represented in your directory. B2B Direct Connect. Customers use preferred social, enterprise, or local account identities to get single sign-on access to applications and APIs. Microsoft Entra B2C. Now let me explain. The first description maps to B2B collaboration. This is the model used when outside users access Microsoft applications or enterprise apps with their own identity while still appearing in your directory as guest users. In a business scenario, this fits a partner or vendor who needs access to shared resources without becoming a full internal user. Next, the second description matches B2B Direct Connect. In this case, the focus is seamless collaboration between Microsoft Entra organizations through a mutual trust relationship. Consequently, it works well for Teams' shared channels, and those external users are not stored in your directory as guest accounts. Then, the third description matches Microsoft Entra B2C. This capability is designed for customer-facing access, where users sign in with social, enterprise, or local accounts to reach applications and APIs. For example, an online shopping app might let customers sign in with a personal account instead of a corporate identity. Question 5. A security team is evaluating a Microsoft Entra ID feature called Authentication Context, which can be used to trigger different access requirements based on the resource or action being requested. They want to confirm which kinds of applications can use this capability. Which option lists an application type that can use authentication context as described? Select one answer. A. Only Azure subscriptions linked to a credit card. B. Applications protected by Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. C. Only decentralized identity hubs. D. Only Kerberos or NTLM domain join services. The correct answer is B. Applications protected by Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. Now let me explain. This question is asking where authentication context can actually be applied. B is correct because authentication context can be used with applications protected by Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, allowing access requirements to change based on the specific resource or action being requested. For example, a user might open a general app page with normal access, but face stronger requirements when trying to view sensitive data. A is incorrect because Azure subscriptions linked to a credit card are billing constructs, not an application type for authentication context. Likewise, C is incorrect because decentralized identity hubs are unrelated to this Microsoft Entra ID capability. D is also incorrect because Kerberos and NTLM domain join services are authentication technologies, not the application category described here. Therefore, the only option that matches the feature as presented is applications protected by Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. So the best answer is B, applications protected by Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. Question 6. Which set best represents administrator-focused responsibilities for running and overseeing identity systems? Select one answer. A. Authenticate and authorize to gain access to systems. B. Restrict everything behind a firewall and stop verifying after initial access. C. Access applications and data using verified credentials. D. Administer or configure an audit or report to monitor and govern identity systems. The correct answer is D. Administer or configure an audit or report to monitor and govern identity systems. Now let me explain. This question focuses on the difference between what end users do and what administrators do. D is correct because administrator responsibilities center on configuring identity systems and then auditing and reporting on them to support monitoring and governance. In a real environment, that means setting up policies, reviewing activity, and checking reports to make sure identity controls are working properly. A is incorrect because authenticating and authorizing are access activities performed by users or applications when they try to reach resources. C is also incorrect because accessing applications and data with verified credentials describes normal usage after verification, not administrative oversight. B is incorrect as well because relying only on a firewall and stopping verification after initial access reflects an outdated perimeter-based approach. Therefore, it does not match modern ID administration, which requires ongoing control, monitoring, and governance. So the best answer is D. Administer or configure an audit or report to monitor and govern identity systems. Question 7. External users can bring their own identities. In this model, who manages the external user's identity and who manages access to your applications? Select one answer. A. You manage the external user's identity and the external identity provider manages access. B. The external user manages both identity and access without any service involvement. C. The external user's identity provider manages their identity, and you manage access using Microsoft Entra ID or Microsoft Entra B2C. D. Microsoft Entra B2C manages the external user's identity provider directly, and you do not manage access. The correct answer is C. The external user's identity provider manages their identity, and you manage access using Microsoft Entra ID or Microsoft Entra B2C. Now let me explain. This question tests the responsibility split in a bring your own identity model. C is correct because the outside identity provider handles the user's identity, while your organization still controls access to your own applications through Microsoft Entra ID or Microsoft Entra B2C. In practice, this is similar to allowing a partner or customer to sign in with an existing account while your organization still decides what that person can open or use. A is incorrect because it reverses the responsibility model. You do not take over management of the external user's identity in this scenario. Instead, access control remains your responsibility. B is also incorrect because access is not left entirely to the user without service involvement. There is still an identity platform enforcing how that user reaches your applications. D is incorrect as well because Microsoft Entra B2C does not remove your responsibility for managing access. Therefore, the best answer is the option where the identity provider manages identity while you manage application access. So the best answer is CC. The external user's identity provider manages their identity, and you manage access using Microsoft Entra ID or Microsoft Entra B2C. Question 8. Microsoft Entra B2C is described as a separate service from Microsoft Entra ID, built on the same technology but for a different purpose. What is that purpose? Select one answer. A. Representing external users as guest users in your directory. B. Establishing two-way trust only for Teams shared channels. C. Creating administrative boundaries within a tenant. D. Providing customer-facing applications where anyone can sign up with no restrictions on user accounts. The correct answer is D. Providing customer-facing applications where anyone can sign up with no restrictions on user accounts. This question is testing the main purpose of Microsoft Entra B2C. D is correct because Microsoft Entra B2C is designed for customer-facing applications where users can sign up and access services as external customers rather than as internal organizational users. A common example would be a retail website or mobile app that allows members of the public to create accounts and sign in. A is incorrect because representing external users as guest users in your directory describes B2B collaboration. In that model, outside users are brought into your directory for collaboration rather than customer sign-up. B is also incorrect because establishing two-way trust for Teams shared channels describes B2B direct connect. That is focused on organization-to-organization collaboration, not customer identity scenarios. C is incorrect as well because creating administrative boundaries within a tenant refers to an administrative management concept, not the purpose of Microsoft Entra B2C. Therefore, the only option that matches the described purpose is customer-facing applications with broad sign-up capability. So, the best answer is D, providing customer-facing applications where anyone can sign up with no restrictions on user accounts. Question 9. An administrator wants to detect an attack that is already occurring or has already happened in an identity and access solution. Which capability best supports this goal? Select one answer. A. Authorization, because it defines what an identity can do after access is granted. B. Auditing, because activities can be logged, reported, and monitored to help detect attacks. C. Identity lifecycle management, because it creates a digital identity when a person is hired. D. Governance, because it is only the act of building a solution once and then leaving it unchanged. The correct answer is B. Auditing, because activities can be logged, reported, and monitored to help detect attacks. Now let me explain. This question is focused on detection. B is correct because auditing gives administrators visibility into what has happened and what may still be happening by logging, reporting, and monitoring activity. In a real environment, this could mean reviewing sign-in logs or suspicious activity reports to identify an ongoing compromise or confirm a past attack. A is incorrect because authorization is about what a user or identity is allowed to do after access is granted. However, defining permissions is not the same as detecting malicious activity. C is also incorrect because identity lifecycle management deals with processes such as creating and managing identities during events like hiring, moving, or leaving. Therefore, it is not the capability primarily used to detect attacks in progress or attacks that already occurred. D is incorrect as well because governance is not simply building a solution once and leaving it unchanged. More importantly, that option does not describe the monitoring and evidence needed for attack detection. So the best answer is B, auditing, because activities can be logged, reported, and monitored to help detect attacks. Question 10. A company requires every person who needs access to Azure resources to have an Azure user account. During sign-on, the user account contains the information needed to authenticate the user, and once the user is authenticated, Microsoft Entra ID builds an access token that authorizes the user and determines what resources they can access and what they can do with those resources. Which component builds the access token after authentication? Select one answer. A. Azure Portal. B. Azure Subscription. C. Microsoft Entra ID. D. Windows Server AD. The correct answer is C. Microsoft Entra. Let me explain. This question is testing which component creates the access token after the user has been authenticated. C is correct because Microsoft Entra ID is the service that builds the access token, and that token is then used to authorize access to Azure resources and permitted actions. In a real environment, this is what allows a signed-in user to access only the resources and operations their identity is allowed to use. A is incorrect because the Azure portal is simply the interface used to work with Azure resources. However, it is not the component that creates the access token. B is also incorrect because an Azure subscription is the container for resources and services. Therefore, it does not perform the authentication token building process. D is incorrect as well because Windows Server AD can be a source for synchronized identities, but it is not identified here as the component that builds the access token for Azure Access. So the best answer is C. Microsoft Entra ID byte. Question 11. For each group-related concept, drag it to the appropriate box in the correct match column to match it to the description in the option column. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. The most common group type used to manage member and computer access to shared resources for a group of users. Security groups. A group type that provides collaboration resources such as a shared mailbox, calendar, files, and a SharePoint site. Microsoft 365 groups. Membership type where members are added and maintained manually. Assigned membership type where members are added based on rules. Dynamic. Now let me explain. The first description matches security groups. This is the standard group type used to manage access to shared resources for users and computers. In practice, this is the kind of group an administrator uses to control who can reach a shared folder, application, or other protected resource. The second description matches Microsoft 365 groups. These groups are built for collaboration, so they provide shared resources such as a mailbox, calendar, files, and a SharePoint site. Therefore, they are focused not just on access control, but also on teamwork features. The third description matches assigned. This membership type means administrators add and maintain members manually. As a result, membership stays under direct administrative control. The fourth description matches dynamic. Here, membership is determined by rules rather than manual updates. Consequently, users are added or removed automatically when they meet the defined conditions. Question 12. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Microsoft Entra B2B collaboration is part of Microsoft Entra external identities and lets you invite external users to sign in using their own credentials to access apps and resources you choose to share. Now let me explain. The first blank is external identities because Microsoft Entra B2B collaboration belongs to the external identities capability set. This is the area used to manage how outside users are invited and allowed to work with your organization's applications and resources. The second blank is credentials, because external users are allowed to sign in with their own existing credentials rather than needing you to create and manage a separate identity for them. For example, a business partner can use an existing sign-in account to reach the specific apps or resources you have shared. Taken together, the sentence describes how B2B collaboration works. It sits under external identities, and it allows invited users to access shared resources with their own credentials. Good like gay. Question 13. Arrange the following steps for bulk inviting Microsoft Entra B2B collaboration users in the correct order. Instruction. Drag and drop the items into the correct order, starting with the first step at the top. Use bulk invite users to prepare a comma-separated value CSV file with the user information and invitation preferences. Upload the .csv file to Microsoft Entra ID. Verify the users were added to the directory. Now let me explain. The first step is to prepare the .csv file using bulk invite users. This file contains the user details and invitation preferences needed for the bulk invitation process. Without that file, there is nothing to upload or process. Next, you upload the .csv file to Microsoft Entra ID. At this stage, the system uses the file contents to carry out the bulk invitation action. In other words, this is the step where the prepared information is actually submitted for processing. Finally, you verify that the users were added to the directory. This confirmation step matters because it shows the invitations were processed successfully and the expected users now appear in the directory. Question 14. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Cross-tenant access settings provide granular control over inbound access, meaning external users accessing your resources, and outbound access, meaning your users accessing external resources when collaborating with other Microsoft Entra organizations or Microsoft clouds. True. B2B Direct Connect establishes a mutual trust relationship for seamless collaboration and currently works with Microsoft Teams shared channels. True. Organizational specific configuration allows configuring inbound and outbound settings per external organization by using organizational settings, adding the tenant, and then configuring the inbound and outbound settings for that tenant. True. Microsoft Cloud-specific configuration can be used to connect to Microsoft clouds such as Azure Government or Azure China and configure collaboration settings. True. Now let me explain. The first statement is true. Cross-tenant access settings are designed to control both inbound and outbound collaboration with other Microsoft Entra organizations and Microsoft clouds. In other words, they let you manage how external users come into your environment and how your users go out to other environments. The second statement is also true. B2B Direct Connect is based on mutual trust for seamless collaboration. Moreover, it currently applies to Microsoft Teams shared channels, which is why it is associated with close organization-to-organization collaboration. The third statement is true as well. Organizational specific settings let administrators add a particular external tenant and then define inbound and outbound rules for that specific organization. Consequently, this gives more targeted control than using only broad default settings. The fourth statement is true. Microsoft Cloud-specific settings support collaboration with Microsoft Cloud environments such as Azure Government and Azure China. Therefore, they are useful when collaboration must be configured across different Microsoft Cloud boundaries. Question 15. A comparison between Azure roles and Microsoft Entra roles includes whether each system supports custom roles. Which statement matches that comparison? Select one answer. A. Only Azure roles support custom roles. B. Only Microsoft Entra roles support custom roles. C. Both Azure roles and Microsoft Entra roles support custom roles. D. Neither Azure roles nor Microsoft Entra roles support custom roles. The correct answer is C. Both Azure roles and Microsoft Entra roles support custom roles. Now let me explain. This question is testing whether custom roles are available in one system or both. C is correct because both Azure roles and Microsoft Entra roles support custom roles. That means organizations can define tailored permissions in each environment when the built-in roles do not fully match operational needs. A is incorrect because custom roles are not limited to Azure roles alone. Likewise, B is incorrect because Microsoft Entra roles are not the only ones that support customization. D is also incorrect because it says neither system supports custom roles. However, the comparison clearly shows that both do. Therefore, the correct choice is the option stating support exists in both Azure roles and Microsoft Entra roles. Question 16. An administrator wants all newly created users in the portal to automatically use a specific domain suffix, for example, @contoso.com, without having to manually select it each time. Why does setting a primary domain name help achieve this? Select one answer. A. The primary domain is the default domain name for a new user when you create a new user. B. The primary domain automatically changes the usernames of all existing users. C. The primary domain is used only for group email addresses and not for user accounts. D. The primary domain can be set only to a federated custom domain. The correct answer is A. The primary domain is the default domain name for a new user when you create a new user. Now let me explain. This question is about default behavior during user creation. A is correct because once a domain is set as the primary domain, it becomes the default suffix for newly created user accounts in the portal. As a result, administrators do not need to manually choose the same domain each time they create a new user. B is incorrect because setting a primary domain does not rename existing user accounts. It affects the default used for new users, not previously created ones. C is also incorrect because the primary domain is not limited to group email addresses. Instead, it is directly relevant to user account creation. D is incorrect as well because the primary domain is not restricted only to federated custom domains. Therefore, the key reason this setting helps is that it provides the default domain name for new users. Question 17. A member user needs to create application registrations, but the organization sets. Users can register applications to no in user settings to prevent general app registration. The organization still wants a few specific people to be able to create application registrations. How can the organization grant that ability back to selected individuals? Select one answer. A. Assign the selected individuals to the application developer role. B. Assign the selected individuals to the billing administrator role. C. Enable security defaults for the tenant. D. Set restrict access to Microsoft Entra administration portal to yes. The correct answer is A. Assign the selected individuals to the application developer role. Now let me explain. This question is about selectively restoring app registration rights after the general setting has been disabled. A is correct because when users can register applications is set to no, specific individuals can still be given that ability by assigning them the application developer role. In practice, this lets the organization keep tight control while still allowing approved developers to register the apps they need. B is incorrect because the billing administrator role is for billing-related responsibilities. It does not grant application registration creation rights. C is also incorrect because security defaults applies baseline security protections. However, it does not selectively return app registration permissions to chosen users. D is incorrect as well because restricting access to the Microsoft Entra administration portal does not grant application registration rights. Therefore, the proper way to restore that capability to selected people is to use the application developer role. Question 18. A user signs in successfully, and a system must decide which Azure resources the user can access and what operations the user is allowed to perform on those resources. In this process, Microsoft Entra ID builds an access token after authentication. What is the purpose of that access token? Select one answer. A. It stores the user's password so the user does not need to sign in again. B. It switches the Azure portal to a different directory. C. It synchronizes the user from an on-premises Active Directory into Azure. D. It authorizes the user by determining what resources the user can access and what actions the user can perform. The correct answer is D. It authorizes the user by determining what resources the user can access and what actions the user can perform. Now let me explain. This question is about what happens after authentication succeeds. D is correct because the access token is used for authorization. In other words, determine which Azure resources the user can access and what actions the user is permitted to perform on those resources. For example, a user may be allowed to view one resource group but not delete resources in another. A is incorrect because an access token does not store the user's password. That is not its purpose in the sign-in process. B is also incorrect because switching the Azure portal to a different directory is a separate portal or directory selection action. It is not the function of the access token. C is incorrect as well because synchronizing a user from on-premises Active Directory into Azure is related to directory synchronization tools and processes. Therefore, it is not what the access token does after authentication. Question 19. A team is deploying Federation to an ADFS farm using a setup wizard that must be able to connect to machines where ADFS and web application proxy will be installed by using Windows Remote Management. Some web application proxy servers are workgroup servers, not domain joined. Which prerequisite set matches this deployment requirement? Select one answer. A. Local administrator credentials on Federation servers. Local administrator credentials on workgroup web application proxy servers, and the wizard machine must be able to connect to target machines using Windows Remote Management. B. Only global administrator credentials in Microsoft Entra ID are required. No local administrator credentials are needed on any servers. C. Local administrator credentials are required only on domain controllers. Web application proxy servers do not require any local administrator credentials. D. The wizard machine must be isolated from all other servers. Windows Remote Management connectivity is not used. The correct answer is A. Local administrator credentials on Federation servers, local administrator credentials on workgroup, web application proxy servers, and the wizard machine must be able to connect to target machines using Windows Remote Management. Now, let me explain. This question is testing the deployment prerequisites for an ADFS farm with web application proxy servers. A is correct because the setup requires local administrator rights on the Federation servers. It also requires local administrator rights on any workgroup web application proxy servers. In addition, the machine running the wizard must be able to reach the target machines through Windows Remote Management. B is incorrect because cloud-level administrator rights alone do not replace the server-level local administrator permissions needed for installation. C is also incorrect because web application proxy servers, especially workgroup servers, still require local administrator credentials for deployment. D is incorrect as well because the scenario specifically says the wizard must connect to the target machines by using Windows Remote Management. Therefore, isolation from other servers and the absence of WinRM connectivity would directly conflict with the requirement. Question 20. An organization has an existing Microsoft 365 tenant. The admin is told they are already using Microsoft Entra ID and can immediately start managing access to integrated cloud apps. What explains why this is true for the tenant? Select one answer. A. Each Microsoft 365 tenant is automatically a Microsoft Entra tenant. B. Microsoft 365 tenants require a manual conversion process before they become Microsoft Entra tenants. C. A Microsoft 365 tenant becomes a Microsoft Entra tenant only after enabling the access management for Azure Resources switch. D. A Microsoft 365 tenant becomes a Microsoft Entra tenant only after creating a custom role. The correct answer is A. Each Microsoft 365 tenant is automatically a Microsoft Entra tenant. Now let me explain. This question is about the relationship between a Microsoft 365 tenant and Microsoft Entra ID. A is correct because every Microsoft 365 tenant already includes a Microsoft Entra tenant. As a result, administrators can begin managing identity and access for integrated cloud applications right away without going through a separate conversion step. B is incorrect because there is no required manual conversion process to turn a Microsoft 365 tenant into a Microsoft Entra tenant. It already exists in that form. C is also incorrect because enabling access management for Azure resources is related to managing Azure Resource Access. However, it is not what makes the Microsoft 365 tenant become a Microsoft Entra tenant. D is incorrect as well because creating a custom role does not create or activate the tenant relationship. Therefore, the correct explanation is that each Microsoft 365 tenant is automatically a Microsoft Entra tenant. Question 21. An organization wants to add, verify, and manage custom domain names in Microsoft Entra ID. Which role is required to manage domains in Microsoft Entra ID? Select one answer. A. Billing administrator. B. User administrator. C. Global administrator. D, help desk administrator. The correct answer is C, global administrator, GAE. Now let me explain. This question is asking which role has the required authority to manage custom domains in Microsoft Entra ID. C is correct because global administrator is the role required to add, verify, and manage domain names. In practice, this is the role used for the highest level tenant administration tasks, including domain management. A is incorrect because billing administrator focuses on purchases, subscriptions, and billing related functions. It does not provide the required domain management authority. B is also incorrect because user administrator is centered on managing users and groups. However, that role is not the required role for domain administration. D is incorrect as well because help desk administrator is intended for support related tasks. Therefore, it does not have the level of access needed to manage custom domains. Question 22, in Microsoft 365, external collaboration options, which 3 activity rows are correctly matched to both the account type and the default setting? Select 3 answers. A, shared channel in Teams, existing Microsoft 365 external account, disabled. B, team sharing, guest account, enabled. C, anonymous meeting join, none, enabled. D, external chat and meetings, guest account, enabled. E, unauthenticated file and folder sharing, guest account, enabled. The correct answers are A, B, B, and C, B. Now let me explain. A is correct because shared channel in Teams uses an existing Microsoft 365 external account, and its default setting is disabled. This reflects a collaboration model that relies on an external Microsoft 365 identity rather than a guest account. B is also correct because team sharing uses a guest account, and the default setting is enabled. In practical terms, this supports routine collaboration where outside users are invited into shared team experiences. C is correct as well because anonymous meeting join does not require an account type, which is why the account type is listed as none, and its default setting is enabled. For example, this allows someone to join a meeting link without first signing into an organizational account. D is incorrect because the row is not matched correctly to both the account type and default setting as presented. E is also incorrect because unauthenticated file and folder sharing is not matched here with guest account and enabled. Therefore, the 3 correctly matched rows are A, B, and C. Question 23. When password hash synchronization, or PHS, synchronizes a password to Microsoft Entra ID, what happens to the password value already stored in the cloud for that user? Select one answer. A, the synchronized password is compared and the older value is kept if it is stronger. B, the synchronized password overwrites the existing cloud password. C, the synchronized password is stored only as a backup and does not affect the cloud password. D, the synchronized password is stored only after a 24-hour delay to prevent accidental changes. The correct answer is B. The synchronized password overwrites the existing cloud password. Now let me explain. This question is testing what PHS does to the cloud stored password value during synchronization. B is correct because when the password is synchronized to Microsoft Entra ID, the synchronized value replaces the existing cloud password for that user. In other words, the cloud value is updated rather than compared, preserved as a backup, or delayed for a long holding period. A is incorrect because this process is not described as a strength comparison where the older value might be kept. Instead, the behavior is overwrite. C is also incorrect because the synchronized password is not stored separately as a backup while leaving the cloud password unchanged. The cloud stored value is actually affected. D is incorrect as well because the process is not described as waiting 24 hours before applying the synchronized password. Therefore, The correct outcome is that the synchronized password overwrites the existing cloud password. Question 24. A company is concerned that attackers sometimes obtain valid usernames and passwords through social engineering. The company wants an ad control that requires users to provide 2 or more authentication elements drawn from categories like something you know, something you possess, and something you are, so that a stolen password alone is not enough to sign in. What solution meets this requirement? Select one answer. A. Microsoft Entra Application Proxy. B. Microsoft Entra Multi-Factor Authentication, or MFA. C. Password Expiration Rules. D. Microsoft Entra Connect. The correct answer is B. Microsoft Entra Multi-Factor Authentication, or MFA. Now let me explain. This question is asking for a control that makes a password alone insufficient for sign-in. B is correct because Microsoft Entra MFA requires 2 or more authentication elements from different factor categories. For example, a user might enter a password and then approve a phone notification, or use a biometric factor. As a result, even if an attacker steals the password, that single factor is not enough. A is incorrect because Microsoft Entra Application Proxy is used for secure remote access to on-premises web applications. However, it is not the feature defined by requiring multiple authentication factors. C is also incorrect because password expiration rules still rely on a password as a single factor. Therefore, they do not solve the problem of a stolen password being used by itself. D is incorrect as well because Microsoft Entra Connect is related to identity synchronization and hybrid identity scenarios. It is not the sign-in control that requires multiple authentication elements. Question 25. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. A communication plan for an MFA rollout can include telling users what they are required dates, important dates, and how to get answers to questions if they have trouble. True, Microsoft provides communication templates to help draft MFA rollout communications, including posters and email templates. True, the mobile app verification code method requires continuous connectivity because it cannot work when connectivity is limited. False, conditional access policies are described as if-then statements that can require a user to complete an action such as multi-factor authentication when accessing a resource. True. Now let me explain. The first statement is true. A communication plan for an MFA rollout is meant to prepare users by explaining what they need to do, when key dates apply, and where they can get help if issues come up. This reduces confusion during deployment. The second statement is also true. Microsoft provides communication templates such as posters and email templates to support MFA rollout messaging. Therefore, organizations do not have to build every communication asset from scratch. The third statement is false. The mobile app verification code method can still work when connectivity is limited. In other words, it is not dependent on continuous connectivity in the way this statement claims. The fourth statement is true. Conditional access policies are commonly described as if-then statements, meaning that if certain conditions are met, then a required action such as MFA can be enforced before access is allowed. Question 26. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Smart Lockout can recognize sign-ins from valid users and treat them differently than sign-ins from attackers or unknown sources. By default, Smart Lockout locks an account for 1 minute after 10 failed sign-in attempts, and then the lockout period can grow longer with further failed attempts. True. Smart Lockout customization requires Microsoft Entra ID free licensing for users. In pass-through authentication scenarios, Microsoft Entra lockout duration is set in minutes, while ADDS lockout duration is set in seconds. Now let me explain. The first statement is true. Smart Lockout is designed to distinguish normal sign-in behavior from suspicious attempts. As a result, it can help protect accounts from attackers while reducing unnecessary disruption for legitimate users. The second statement is also true. The default behavior is a 1-minute lockout after 10 failed sign-in attempts. Then if failed attempts continue, the lockout duration can increase. The third statement is false. Smart Lockout customization does not use Microsoft Entra ID free for this purpose. Instead, customization requires Microsoft Entra ID Premium P1 or a higher license. The fourth statement is false. In pass-through authentication scenarios, the timing units are the reverse of what the statement says. Microsoft Entra lockout duration is set in seconds, while ADDS lockout duration is set in minutes. Question 27. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Microsoft analyzes 6.5 trillion signals per day to identify and protect customers from threats, and Microsoft Entra Identity Protection requires a Microsoft Entra ID Premium P2 license to operate. Now let me explain. The first blank is 6.5 trillion. Because that is the stated number of signals Microsoft analyzes each day to help detect threats and protect customers. This shows the scale of telemetry involved in Microsoft's security analysis. The second blank is P2 because Microsoft Entra Identity Protection requires Microsoft Entra ID Premium P2 for its full identity protection capabilities, including risk-based protection features. Therefore, the complete sentence is 6.5 trillion and P2. Question 28. For each networking port, drag it to the appropriate box in the correct match column to match it against its associated protocol. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Port 22, Secure Shell, or SSH. Port 80, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP. Port 443, Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, or HTTPS. Port 445, Server Message Blocks, or SMB, File Sharing. Port 3389, Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP. Now let me explain. Port 22 matches SSH because it is commonly used for secure remote command line access to systems. In real environments, administrators use it to manage servers securely over a network. Next, port 80 matches HTTP because it is the standard port for regular web traffic that is not encrypted. By contrast, port 443 matches HTTPS, which is the secure encrypted version used by most modern websites. Then, port 445 matches SMB file sharing, because SMB is the protocol used for shared files and folders across Windows-based networks. Consequently, this port is closely tied to file access across systems. Finally, port 3389 matches RDP because Remote Desktop Protocol uses that port to allow users or administrators to connect to another computer's desktop remotely. Therefore, the correct matches are based on each protocol's standard network port. Question 29. A conditional access design includes this rule. If a user is in Group 1, then require MFA to access App 1, no other conditional access policies apply. A user who is not in Group 1 attempts to access App 1, what happens by default, and what must be done if the organization wants to prevent all non-Group 1 users from accessing App 1. Select one answer. A. An access token is issued by default to prevent all non-Group 1 users. Create a separate policy to block all other users. B. The access is blocked by default to allow the user, add them to Group 1. C. MFA is forced by default to avoid MFA, exclude the user from Group 1. D. No access token is issued by default to allow access, disable conditional access, disable conditionant. The correct answer is A. An access token is issued by default to prevent all non-Group 1 users. create a separate policy to block all other users. Now let me explain. This question is testing how conditional access applies only to users who meet the policy assignment. A is correct because a policy targeting Group 1 does not automatically affect users outside Group 1. Therefore, if a user is not in Group 1 and no other policy applies, access is allowed by default and an access token is issued. Next, the second part of the answer matters just as much. If the organization wants to stop every non-Group 1 user from reaching App 1, it must create a separate blocking policy for those other users. In real terms, one policy requires MFA for the approved group, while another policy blocks everyone else. B is incorrect because access is not automatically blocked for users outside the assigned group. C is also incorrect because MFA is not forced on a user who does not fall under the Group 1 assignment. D is incorrect as well because conditional access does not deny access by default when no applicable policy exists. Question 30. A team uses non-interactive service accounts in scripts to access cloud apps programmatically. They are building a baseline conditional access policy and learn that MFA cannot be completed programmatically for these accounts. They also want a longer-term approach that reduces reliance on these accounts. What approach best matches the guidance? Select one answer. A. Remove all exclusions so the baseline policy applies to every account type equally. B. Require MFA for the service accounts so the scripts can complete MFA during execution. C. Replace the service accounts with managed identities when possible, and, as a temporary workaround, exclude the specific service accounts from the baseline policy. D. Rely on conditional access to block all service principal calls automatically without any design changes. The correct answer is C. Replace the service accounts with managed identities when possible, and, as a temporary workaround, exclude the specific service accounts from the baseline policy. Now let me explain. This question is about balancing immediate operational needs with a better long-term identity design. C is correct because non-interactive service accounts used in scripts cannot complete MFA programmatically. Therefore, forcing them through a baseline MFA requirement would break the automation. The recommended long-term direction is to move to managed identities where possible, while the short-term workaround is to exclude only the necessary service accounts from the baseline policy. A is incorrect because removing all exclusions would apply the policy to accounts that cannot satisfy interactive MFA requirements. As a result, the scripts would fail. B is also incorrect because these service accounts cannot complete MFA during automated execution. So, requiring MFA does not solve the problem. D is incorrect as well, because conditional access does not automatically block all service principal calls in the simple way described here. Consequently, that option does not match the stated guidance. Question 31. A security team wants to block access to a specific cloud app for a specific set of users based on risk factors. One example risk factor they plan to use is that the users are using client certificates as a form of device management. Which conditional access app control capability matches this goal? Select one answer. A. Granularly block access for specific apps and users depending on risk factors, such as blocking when client certificates are used as device management. B. Force all users to download every sensitive document so it can be labeled later. C. Allow unlabeled sensitive files to upload so they can be classified after sharing. D. Disable reverse proxy routing so sessions cannot be controlled. The correct answer is A. Granularly block access for specific apps and users depending on risk factors, such as blocking when client certificates are used as device management. Now let me explain. This question is focused on conditional access app control as a session control capability. A is correct because it supports granular blocking for particular apps and particular users. based on defined risk factors. In this case, the use of client certificates for device management is the example condition that can trigger the block. So the control is precise, not broad, and tied to the risk context of the session. B is incorrect because forcing downloads of sensitive documents increases exposure instead of reducing it. C is also incorrect because allowing unlabeled sensitive files to upload before protection is applied does not match a risk-reducing control. D is incorrect as well because conditional access app control depends on reverse proxy routing to inspect and control sessions. Therefore, disabling that routing would remove the control rather than enable it. Question 32. A security engineer is registering an application that must query identity protection data by using Microsoft Graph application permissions. Which two permissions are required, and which production-ready approach should be used to secure credentials? Select three answers. A. Identity risk event read all. B. User read all. C. Identity risk user read all. D. Store the client's secret directly in code for easier deployment. E. Use managed identities for Azure resources to secure credentials. The correct answers are A. Identity risk event.read all. C. Identity risky user read all. And E. Use managed identities for Azure resources to secure credentials. Now let me explain. A is correct because the application needs permission to read identity protection risk event data through Microsoft Graph. C is also correct because the application must be able to read risky user information as part of identity protection data access. These two permissions cover the required identity protection data types in the scenario. E is correct because managed identities are the production-ready approach for securing credentials in Azure resources. They reduce the need to store secrets in application code or configuration, which lowers exposure risk and improves operational security. B is incorrect because user read all is not the specific application permission required here for identity protection risk event and risky user data. D is also incorrect because storing a client's secret directly in code increases the chance of credential exposure. Therefore, the correct selections are identity risk event read.all, identity risky user read all, and use managed identities for Azure resources to secure credentials. Question 33. A network analyst is reviewing dashboard widgets. They need a widget that 1. Shows all types of traffic by default, 2. Sorts results by number of transactions by default, 3. Uses last 24 hours as the time window for its transactions, users, devices, and bytes metrics. And 4, allows drilling into more detail by selecting a View All Destinations button. They also want to know what happens when a web content blocked alert appears in Alerts and Notifications preview. Which option correctly describes these behaviors? Select one answer. A. The cross-tenant access widget shows all traffic and sorts by transactions. Its filters report last 24 hours values for blocked websites. And web content blocked alerts only indicate disconnected device links. B. The device status widget shows all traffic and sorts by transactions. Its filters report last 24 hours values for tenant IDs. And selecting View All Destinations opens session management for tenant restrictions. C. The usage profiling widget shows all traffic and sorts by transactions. Its filters report last 24 hours values for bytes by IP destination, and web content blocked alerts automatically disable all web categories. D. The top used destinations widget shows all traffic and sorts by transactions. Its filters report last 24 hours values for transactions, users, distinct UPN, devices, distinct device IDs, bytes sent, IP destinations, and bytes received. IP destinations and View All Destinations shows more details. A web content blocked alert can link to a related alert detail page with more information. The correct answer is D. The top used destinations widget shows all traffic and sorts by transactions. Its filters report last 24 hours values for transactions, users, distinct UPN, devices, distinct device IDs, bytes sent, IP destinations, and bytes received, IP destinations, IP destinations. And View All Destinations shows more details. A web content blocked alert can link to a related alert detail page with more information. Now, let me explain. This question is really about matching a very specific widget behavior to the correct dashboard component. D is correct because the top used destinations widget is the one described as showing all traffic by default, sorting by transactions, using last 24 hours metrics for transactions, users, devices, bytes sent, and bytes received, and also allowing deeper review through View All Destinations. In addition, when a web content blocked alert appears, it can take the analyst to a related alert detail page with more information. A is incorrect because the cross-tenant access widget focuses on tenant-related access activity, not top destination traffic behavior, sorting, or destination drill down. Also, a web content blocked alert is not merely a disconnected device link indicator. B is also incorrect because the device status widget centers on device activity and status measures, not destination traffic analysis with View All Destinations. Likewise, that navigation description does not fit the behavior being asked about. C is incorrect as well because the usage profiling widget is not the one defined here with the exact default sorting, destination drill down, and alert behavior. Moreover, a web content blocked alert does not automatically disable all web categories. It indicates blocked content activity and can lead to more detailed alert information. Question 34. A user signs in by entering a username and password, then provides a second factor using a code from an app. In this flow, what role is the Authenticator app performing? Select one answer. A. It is replacing the need for any verification step after username and password. B. It is acting as a device enrollment tool for operating systems. C. It is acting as an OAuth HotP generator supported by Microsoft Entra ID. D. It is acting as a software token generating an OAuth verification code. The correct answer is D. It is acting as a software token generating an OAuth verification code. Now let me explain. This question focuses on the role of the Authenticator app during multi-factor authentication. D is correct because the app is functioning as a software token that generates an OAuth verification code. That code becomes the second authentication factor after the user has already entered a username and password. In practical terms, the app is proving possession of the registered device or token source. A is incorrect because the app is not removing the need for additional verification. It is actually providing that additional verification step. B is also incorrect because device enrollment is a different function entirely. It is not the role being performed when the user enters a verification code during sign-in. C is incorrect as well because Microsoft Entra ID is not described here as supporting OAuth HotP for this purpose. Therefore, the correct description is that the Authenticator app acts as a software token generating an OAuth verification code. Question 35. An administrator is creating new conditional access policies and is concerned that a configuration mistake could lock administrators out of the Azure portal. What is the recommended mitigation? Select one answer. A. Disable conditional access until all users have premium P2 licenses. B. Rely on report-only mode as the only mitigation and avoid creating emergency accounts. C. Enable a block access policy for all users, including administrators, to ensure consistent enforcement. D. Create 2 or more emergency access accounts that are not impacted by the policy. The correct answer is D. Create 2 or more emergency access accounts that are not impacted by the policy. Now let me explain. This question is about preventing administrative lockout during conditional access rollout. D is correct because emergency access accounts provide a recovery path if a policy is misconfigured and blocks normal administrator sign-in. In practice, these accounts are kept outside the policy scope so administrators can still regain access and fix the problem. A is incorrect because disabling conditional access is not the recommended mitigation for this risk. B is also incorrect because report-only mode helps evaluate policy impact, but it is not enough by itself and does not replace the need for emergency access accounts. C is incorrect as well because blocking all users, including administrators, could create the exact lockout scenario the organization is trying to avoid. Therefore, the recommended safeguard is to create 2 or more emergency access accounts that are not affected by the policy. Question 36. An administrator wants to understand how many users would be affected by new conditional access initiatives such as blocking legacy authentication, requiring MFA, and implementing sign-in risk policies before turning those policies on. Which feature supports this evaluation? Select one answer. A, report-only mode. B, session controls. C, access token format selection. D, named locations. The correct answer is A, report-only mode. Now let me explain. This question is about testing conditional access impact before enforcement. A is correct because report-only mode lets administrators evaluate how policies would behave and which users would be affected before the policies are actually turned on. That makes it useful for safely reviewing the effect of blocking legacy authentication, requiring MFA, or applying sign-in risk policies. B is incorrect because session controls manage how access is controlled within cloud apps after policy evaluation, not how policy impact is previewed before enablement. C is also incorrect because access token format selection relates to token behavior and API configuration, not to estimating how many users a conditional access policy would affect. D is incorrect as well because named locations are used as policy conditions for places or networks. However, they do not provide the evaluate before enabling capability. Question 37. An organization wants to restrict when users can register security information for multi-factor authentication and self-service password reset. They want to control this with conditional access user actions, and they want to use conditions such as trusted network location to limit when registration is allowed. What prerequisite must be enabled for this preview capability? Select one answer. A, the combined registration preview must be enabled. B, all users must be assigned Microsoft Entra ID Premium P1 licenses. C, all devices must be enrolled into Intune before registration can occur. D, a terms of use PDF must be uploaded into identity governance. The correct answer is A, the combined registration preview must be enabled. Now let me explain. This question is asking for the prerequisite to control MFA and self-service password reset registration through conditional access user actions. A is correct because that preview capability depends on the combined registration preview being enabled. Once that prerequisite is in place, organizations can apply conditions such as trusted network location to control when registration is allowed. B is incorrect because the requirement here is not described as assigning Premium P1 to all users as the prerequisite for this specific preview behavior. C is also incorrect because Intune enrollment relates to device management, not to enabling this registration control capability. D is incorrect as well because uploading a terms of use PDF into identity governance is unrelated to the prerequisite for conditional access control of security information registration. Question 38. An organization uses both device management or MDM and app protection policies or MAM and also supports employees who use both a corporate phone and a personal tablet. Which two statements correctly describe how MDM and MAM can be used together and how MAM targeting can work? Select two answers. A, if a MAM policy is applied to a user without setting device state, the user receives that MAM policy on both the BYOD device and the Intune managed device. B, a corporate phone can be enrolled in MDM and also protected by app protection policies, while a personal device can be protected by app protection policies only. C, MDM cannot be used at the same time as app protection policies. Organizations must choose only one approach. D, a MAM policy always applies only to unmanaged devices and can never apply to Intune managed devices. The correct answers are A and B. Now let me explain. A is correct because when a MAM policy is assigned at the user level without using device state targeting, that policy can apply across both unmanaged and Intune managed devices used by that person. So if the same user has a personal tablet and a managed corporate phone, both can receive the app protection policy. B is also correct because MDM and app protection policies can be used together. A corporate device can be enrolled and managed through MDM while still having app-level protections applied. At the same time, a personal device can remain outside full device enrollment and still be protected through app protection policies alone. C is incorrect because organizations do not have to choose only one of the two approaches. They can combine MDM and MAM depending on the device scenario. D is incorrect as well because MAM-M is not limited only to unmanaged devices. Depending on how targeting is configured, it can also apply to Intune managed devices. Question 39. You are selecting an authentication method in Microsoft Entra that supports passwordless style sign-in as a primary authentication factor, but only as a preview capability. You also need the same method to be usable for both MFA and service password reset, or SSPR, as a secondary verification method. Which option meets this exact requirement? Select one answer. A, voice call. B, FIDO2 security key. C, SMS. D, Windows Hello for Business. The correct answer is C, SMS. Now let me explain. This question is looking for one method that fits two requirements at the same time. First, it must support primary authentication in a preview capacity, and second, it must also work as a secondary verification method for both MFA and SSPR. C is correct because SMS matches that exact combination. A is incorrect because voice call can be used as a secondary method for MFA and SSPR. However, it does not satisfy the primary authentication requirement in this scenario. B is also incorrect because FIDO2 security keys support strong primary authentication, but they do not match this exact combined requirement of preview primary authentication plus use for both MFA and SSPR secondary verification in the way described here. D is incorrect as well because Windows Hello for Business supports primary authentication, yet it does not meet the same specific combination required by the question. Therefore, the best answer is SMS. Question 40. Your organization is deploying Microsoft Entra password protection. A team proposes skipping the proxy service because the domain controllers already have outbound internet access. Which statement aligns with the deployment requirement? Select one answer. A, proxy service deployment is required only for read-only domain controllers. B, proxy service deployment is optional if the forest functional level is Windows Server 2012 or higher. C, proxy service deployment is a mandatory requirement for deploying Microsoft Entra password protection, even if the domain controller has outbound direct internet connectivity. D, proxy service deployment is optional if password hash sync is enabled. The correct answer is C. Proxy service deployment is a mandatory requirement for deploying Microsoft Entra password protection, even if the domain controller has outbound direct internet connectivity. Now let me explain. This question is testing a specific deployment prerequisite for Microsoft Entra password protection. C is correct because the proxy service is required as part of the deployment design. Even if a domain controller can already reach the internet directly, That does not remove the need for the proxy service. A is incorrect because the proxy requirement is not limited only to read-only domain controllers. B is also incorrect because forest functional level does not make the proxy optional. D is incorrect as well because enabling password hash sync does not remove the proxy service requirement for Microsoft Entra password protection. Therefore, the correct statement is that proxy service deployment remains mandatory even when the domain controller has outbound direct internet connectivity. Question 41. You are configuring Microsoft Entra authentication for Azure virtual machines so that local sign-in requirements are governed centrally. Which two benefits come specifically from Microsoft Entra ID password settings being applied through Microsoft Entra ID configuration? Select two answers. A. Blocking all VM sign-ins unless the VM is domain joined to on-premises ADDS. B. Removing the need for any role-based access controls. C. Password complexity policies configured for Microsoft Entra ID. D. Password lifetime policies configured for Microsoft Entra ID. The correct answers are C. Password complexity policies configured for Microsoft Entra ID, and D. Password lifetime policies configured for Microsoft Entra ID. Now let me explain. C is correct because when Microsoft Entra authentication is used for Azure virtual machines, password complexity requirements can be enforced through the password policy settings configured in Microsoft Entra ID. This helps ensure centrally managed sign-in standards for those VMs. D is also correct because password lifetime settings in Microsoft Entra ID can be applied as part of that centralized configuration. Consequently, expiration and rotation requirements can be governed from the identity platform rather than managed separately on each machine. A is incorrect because Microsoft Entra authentication for Azure VMs does not require the VM to be domain joined to on-premises ADDS. Therefore, this is not a benefit tied to Microsoft Entra password settings. B is incorrect as well because role-based access controls are still needed to determine who can sign in and what level of access they receive. Password settings do not replace authorization controls. Question 42. Which role has full access to identity protection but cannot reset a user's password? Select one answer. A. Security reader. B. Security operator. C. Security administrator. D. Conditional access administrator. The correct answer is C. Security administrator. Now let me explain. This question is testing the scope of roles within identity protection. C is correct because the security administrator role has full access to identity protection capabilities. However, it does not include the ability to reset a user's password. So it provides broad security oversight without that specific password reset action. A is incorrect because Security Reader can view identity protection information, but it does not have full access to manage or act on it. B is also incorrect because Security Operator can perform some operational actions, yet it still does not have the full level of identity protection access described in the question. D is incorrect as well because Conditional Access Administrator focuses on conditional access policy management, not full identity protection access. Therefore, the best answer is Security Administrator. Question 43. In the JSON permissions block for a custom role, which list contains allowed operations such as Microsoft.billing*/read, select one answer. A. Not actions. B. Assignable scopes. C. Description. D. The answer is D. Actions. Now let me explain. This question is asking which JSON list defines the operations a custom role is allowed to perform. D is correct because the actions list is where allowed operations are specified. An entry such as Microsoft.billing*/read is an example of an allowed action pattern placed in that list. A is incorrect because not actions is used to exclude operations, not to define the main allowed set. B is also incorrect because assignable scopes defines where the role can be assigned, rather than what the role is permitted to do. C is incorrect as well because description is only explanatory text about the role. It does not hold operational permissions. Question 44, your organization uses a federated sign-in model with ADFS 2019. You want controls that provide functionality similar to Smart Lockout to help reduce the impact of password spray and brute force attempts against externally facing sign-ins. Which ADFS features provide those similar benefits? Select one answer. A. Microsoft Entra, Password Protection Proxy, and DC Agent. B. Password hash sync and pass-through authentication. C. ADFS Extranet Lockout and Extranet Smart Lockout. D. Windows Hello for Business and Microsoft Authenticator. The correct answer is C. ADFS Extranet Lockout and Extranet Smart Lockout. Now let me explain. This question is asking which ADFS features provide Smart Lockout style protection for federated external sign-ins. C is correct because ADFS Extranet Lockout and Extranet Smart Lockout are designed to reduce repeated failed sign-in attempts from external access paths. As a result, they help defend against password spray and brute force activity in a federated deployment. A is incorrect because Microsoft Entra Password Protection Proxy and DC Agent are used for password policy enforcement in Active Directory, not for ADFS Extranet Lockout behavior. B is also incorrect because password hash sync and pass-through authentication are hybrid sign-in options, not the ADFS features that provide Smart Lockout-like protection. D is incorrect as well because Windows Hello for Business and Microsoft Authenticator are authentication methods, not ADFS Extranet Lockout controls. Therefore, the correct choice is ADFS Extranet Lockout and Extranet Smart Lockout. Question 45. A security administrator wants to create an OAuth app policy in Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, but prefers to start from the policy management area rather than from the OAuth apps list. Which navigation path supports creating an OAuth app policy that way? Select one answer. A. Select Control, then Policies, then Create Policy, then OAuth app policy. B. Select Identity, then Roles and Admins, then Roles and Administrators. C. Select Enterprise Applications, then Properties, then Notes. D. Select Cloud Apps, then Cloud Discovery, then App Catalog. The correct answer is A. Select Control, then Policies, then Create Policy, then OAuth App Policy. Now let me explain. This question is asking for the navigation path that starts from policy management and leads directly to OAuth app policy creation. A is correct because that path begins in the control area, moves into policies, and then uses create policy to open the OAuth app policy option. So it matches the requirement exactly. B is incorrect because that path is related to role administration, not OAuth app policy creation. This C is also incorrect because enterprise applications, properties, and notes deal with app settings or information, not policy creation in Defender for cloud apps. D is incorrect as well because cloud apps, cloud discovery, and app catalog are used for discovery and catalog views, rather than creating an OAuth app policy from the policy management area. Question 46. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Token lifetimes issued by Microsoft Identity Platform can be customized for all apps in your organization or for a specific service principal in your organization. Now let me explain. The first blank is all apps in your organization, because token lifetime settings can be applied broadly across applications in the organization. This provides centralized control when the same token lifetime behavior should apply widely. The second blank is specific service principal in your organization, because token lifetime customization can also be targeted more narrowly to one service principal. Consequently, Administrators can apply more granular control when different applications need different token lifetime behavior. That. Question 47. A company wants to provide secure remote access to on-premises applications through Microsoft Entra Application Proxy, so users can complete single sign-on once and then access published apps. Which three options are examples of applications that can be published for remote access and single sign-on using this approach? Select three answers. A. Teams. B. Tableau. C. Qlik. D. An internal-only app that is intended to be used solely by on-network users to avoid performance issues. The correct answers are A. Teams. B. Tableau. And C. Qlik. Now let me explain. A is correct because Teams is listed as an example of an application type that can be published through Microsoft Entra Application Proxy for remote access and single sign-on. B is also correct because Tableau is another example of an application that can be published in this way. C is correct as well because Qlik is included among the application examples that support this approach. D is incorrect because it describes an app intended to remain for on-network use only. That does not align with the goal of using application proxy to provide secure remote access for users outside the internal network. Question 48. For each protocol statement, drag it to the appropriate boxes in the correct match column to match it against its description in the option column. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. A protocol used for authorization, OAuth. A protocol used for authentication and built on top of OAuth 2.0, OpenID Connect, or OIDC. A protocol used for authentication that is commonly used with identity providers such as Active Directory Federation Services or ADFS, federated to Microsoft Entra ID and is frequently used in enterprise applications. Security Assertion Markup Language, or SAML, commonly used for apps that are purely in the cloud, such as mobile apps, websites, and web APIs, OpenID Connect, or OIDC. In one request, this protocol can authenticate a user, and OAuth can provide authorization to access a protected resource the user owns, OpenID Connect, or OIDC. Now let me explain. The first statement matches OAuth, because OAuth is the protocol used for authorization. It is concerned with granting access to protected resources rather than directly performing user authentication. The second statement matches OpenID Connect because OIDC is built on top of OAuth 2.0 and adds authentication capabilities. As a result, it is commonly used when an application needs to know who the user is and then continue with authorized access flows. The third statement matches SAML because Security Assertion Markup Language is widely used for authentication in enterprise environments, especially with federation scenarios involving providers such as ADFS and Microsoft Entra ID. The fourth statement also matches OpenID Connect because OIDC is commonly used for modern cloud-native apps such as mobile applications, websites, and web APIs. The fifth statement again matches OpenID Connect because OIDC can handle the authentication portion while OAuth provides the authorization portion in the same overall request flow. Consequently, OIDC appears more than once in this matching set. Question 49. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. When an application is registered in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center, an application object and a service principal object are automatically created in the home tenant. True, a service principal must be created in each tenant where an application is used so it can establish an identity for sign-in and/or resource access secured by that tenant. True, any changes made to an application object are reflected in service principals in every tenant where the app is used. False. Restoring a deleted application object through the Microsoft Entra Admin Center also restores its corresponding home tenant service principal automatically. False. Now let me explain. The first statement is true. Registering an application in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center creates both an application object and a home tenant service principal automatically. That gives the app both its global definition and its tenant-specific identity in the home tenant. The second statement is also true. A service principal is tenant local. So each tenant that uses the application needs its own service principal for authentication or access to resources protected in that tenant. In other words, the app definition can be shared but the usable identity inside a tenant is local to that tenant. The third statement is false. Changes to the application object are not reflected across service principals in every tenant where the app is used. Instead, the reflection is limited to the service principal in the application's home tenant, while service principals in other tenants remain separate. The fourth statement is false. Restoring a deleted application object does not automatically restore the corresponding home tenant service principal as part of the same action. Therefore, recovering the application object alone does not mean the paired service principal is automatically brought back. Question 50. When reviewing cloud discovery results, which dashboard element is used to see how discovered apps are distributed by geographic location based on the app's headquarters? Select one answer. A. Discovery alert status. B. App headquarters map. C. High-level usage overview. D. Top users and source IP addresses. The correct answer is B. App headquarters map. Now let me explain. This question is asking which dashboard element shows geographic distribution based on where the discovered apps are headquartered. B is correct because the app headquarters map is specifically used to visualize discovered apps by geographic location according to their headquarters. That makes it the dashboard component designed for this exact purpose. A is incorrect because discovery alert status is used to review alert activity and investigation needs, not geographic distribution. C is also incorrect because high-level usage overview summarizes usage patterns at a broader level, rather than showing headquarters-based map distribution. D is incorrect as well because top users and source IP addresses focuses on user activity and traffic sources, not the geographic spread of discovered app headquarters. Question 51. An organization enables end-user consent. A user attempts to grant consent to an application, but Microsoft detects the consent request as risky. What happens to that consent request? Select one answer. A. The user consent prompt automatically approves the request because end-user consent is enabled. B. The request requires a step up to admin consent instead of end-user consent. C. The request is denied silently with no user-facing indication. D. The user is prompted to classify permissions as low impact before consenting. The correct answer is B. The request requires a step up to admin consent instead of end-user consent. Now, let me explain. This question is about what happens when a risky consent request is detected even though end-user consent is enabled. B is correct because risk-based step-up consent is designed to reduce exposure to malicious or suspicious applications. So when Microsoft identifies the request as risky, the process is escalated and admin consent is required instead of allowing the user to approve it directly. A is incorrect because enabling end-user consent does not mean every consent request is automatically approved. Risky requests are handled more strictly. C is also incorrect because the request is not described as being denied silently without any user-facing indication. Instead, the flow shifts to require admin approval. D is incorrect as well because the user is not asked to classify permissions as low impact before continuing. Therefore, the correct outcome is a step up to admin consent. Question 52. A user completes sign-in and reaches an on-premises application through application proxy. The request is delivered to the on-premises application through the application proxy connector. How does the on-premises application's response reach the user? Select one answer. A. The response is sent directly from the on-premises application to the user without passing through any other component. B. The response is returned only to Microsoft Entra ID, and Microsoft Entra ID displays it to the user. C. The response is stored on the client device, and the user must manually retrieve it from the connector. D. The response is sent through the connector and the application proxy service to the user. The correct answer is D. The response is sent through the connector and the application proxy service to the user. Now let me explain. This question is testing the traffic flow in Microsoft Entra Application Proxy. D is correct because the response follows the same connected path back. The on-premises application sends the response to the connector, then the connector passes it to the application proxy service, and the service delivers it to the user. A is incorrect because the application does not send the response directly back to the user while bypassing the proxy components. B is also incorrect because Microsoft Entra ID is involved in authentication and token-related functions, not in directly presenting the app response instead of the proxy path. C is incorrect as well because the response is not stored on the client for manual retrieval. Therefore, the correct return path is through the connector and the application proxy service to the user. Question 53. For each stakeholder team involved in planning access reviews, drag it to the appropriate box in the correct match column to match it against its responsibility. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Manages IT infrastructure and administers cloud investments and software as a service, or SaaS. Apps, IT administration, builds and maintains applications for the organization, development teams, manages projects and owns applications. Business units, ensures the organization follows internal policy and complies with regulations. Corporate governance. Now let me explain. The first responsibility matches IT administration because that team typically manages the organization's IT infrastructure and oversees cloud and SaaS administration. So this is the group most closely aligned to infrastructure and service management responsibilities. The second responsibility matches development teams because they're the teams that build and maintain the organization's applications. In other words, they are responsible for creating and sustaining the apps that users depend on. The third responsibility matches business units because those teams commonly manage projects and own applications from the operational side of the organization. Therefore, they are closely tied to application ownership and project oversight. The fourth responsibility matches corporate governance because that function is focused on internal policy adherence and regulatory compliance. As a result, it aligns with ensuring the organization follows policies and meets compliance obligations. Question 54. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. A cloud administrator can onboard Azure resources into Privileged Identity Management, or PIM, by discovering the target resources and selecting which ones to manage. And PIM does not impose a fixed cap on how many eligible resources can be brought under management. True. In the PIM discovery workflow for Azure resources, an administrator can narrow visible management groups or subscriptions they are authorized to modify by applying the resource state filter and the select resource type filter. True. Selecting unmanaged Azure resources in the discovery view and then choosing manage resource places those selected resources under PIM management. True. When a new child Azure resource is created beneath a management group that is already managed by PIM, the administrator can locate that child resource in PIM and add it under management. True. Now let me explain. The first statement is true. PM onboarding for Azure resources includes discovering resources and selecting which ones to manage. It is designed for management at scale. So it is not described as enforcing a small fixed cap on eligible resources. The second statement is also true. In the discovery workflow, filters such as resource state and select resource type help narrow what the administrator sees. Consequently, they can focus on the management groups or subscriptions they are authorized to modify. The third statement is true as well. When unmanaged Azure resources are selected in the discovery view and the administrator chooses Manage Resource, those resources are brought under PIM management. That is the standard onboarding action in this workflow. The fourth statement is true. A newly created child resource under a managed management group can still be found through PIM discovery and then added under management. Therefore, administrators can bring new child resources into scope after they appear. Question 55. A privileged access group owner needs to review only the actions they personally performed within a specific privileged access group. They do not want the audit results to include activity from other group members or other owners. Which PIM audit view should they use? Select one answer. A, resource audit. B, all activity audit. C, my audit. D, role assignment audit. The correct answer is C, my audit. Now let me explain. This question is asking for the PIM audit view that isolates only one person's own actions within a privileged access group. C is correct because my audit is specifically intended for reviewing the activity performed by the current user. As a result, it excludes actions generated by other members or other owners and keeps the view focused on personal activity only. A is incorrect because resource audit shows activity related to the privileged access group more broadly, not just one person's actions. B is also incorrect because all activity audit is not the specific named view used here for isolating personal actions within this context. D is incorrect as well because role assignment audit is not the audit view identified for reviewing only the user's own actions in a privileged access group. Therefore, the correct choice is my audit. Question 56. A compliance analyst is preparing evidence for an internal review and needs to access records of system activities in Microsoft Entra ID. Using the portal navigation, which option should the analyst select to open the audit report? Select one answer. Sign-ins in the monitoring section of Microsoft Entra ID. B. Audit logs in the monitoring section of Microsoft Entra ID. C. Users in the monitoring section of Microsoft Entra ID. Enterprise applications in the monitoring section of Microsoft Entra ID. The correct answer is B. Audit logs in the monitoring section of Microsoft Entra ID. Now let me explain. This question is about where to open the audit report for system activity records in Microsoft Entra ID. B is correct because audit logs in the monitoring section is the place used to review records of system activities for compliance, investigation, and change tracking. So that is the correct navigation path for this need. A is incorrect because sign-ins focuses on authentication activity, not the broader system activity records typically used for audit reporting. C is also incorrect because users is for managing and reviewing user objects rather than opening audit records of system actions. D is incorrect as well because enterprise applications is used for application-related management, not as the direct location for the audit report of system activities. Question 57. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Security controls can affect the user experience, so changes made to strengthen identity security may also influence usability. True. Security controls with a low level of user lockdown typically have minimal impact on normal day-to-day user activity. True. Achieving a strong identity secure score requires applying the maximum possible user lockdown setting to every security control. False. An identity secure score increases only when technical security settings are configured and does not change when administrators complete activities such as reviewing security reports. False. Now let me explain. The first statement is true. Security controls are judged not only by the protection they provide, but also by how much they affect users during normal work. So stronger identity security can influence usability as well. The second statement is also true. Low lockdown controls are intended to improve security while causing little or no disruption to routine user tasks. Therefore, they usually have minimal impact on normal day-to-day activity. The third statement is false. A strong identity secure score does not mean every control must be pushed to the maximum restriction level. Effective security is about balancing protection with usability, not automatically choosing the harshest setting everywhere. The fourth statement is false. Identity secure score can change not only from technical configuration changes, but also from certain security-related activities such as reviewing relevant reports. Consequently, it is not limited only to setting changes. Question 58. An administrator is setting up a recurring monthly access review and wants to ensure that each review period ends before the next monthly cycle begins. Which duration is the maximum that can be configured for a monthly review? Select one answer. A, 27 days. B, 30 days. C, 31 days. D, 14 days. The correct answer is A, 27 days. Now let me explain. This question is about the maximum supported duration for a monthly access review without causing overlap with the next monthly cycle. A is correct because a monthly access review can be configured for up to 27 days. This allows the review to finish before the next monthly occurrence begins. B is incorrect because 30 days is longer than the allowed maximum for this monthly review configuration. As a result, it could create overlap with the next scheduled cycle. C is also incorrect because 31 days exceeds the supported maximum even further. Therefore, it would not fit the requirement of keeping one review period clear of the next. D is incorrect as well because 14 days is a valid shorter duration, but it is not the maximum that can be configured. Question 59. A subscription owner is preparing to use Microsoft Entra Privileged Identity Management, or PIM, to protect Azure resources used by live business workloads. They want to follow the recommended onboarding approach so that the highest risk resources are governed first. Which choice best aligns with that recommendation? Select one answer. A, start by managing every resource in the tenant because there is a limit on how many can be managed. B, start with the most critical production resources, even though there is no limit to the number of resources that can be managed. C, start only with test subscriptions because production resources cannot be managed by PIM. D, start with only child resources because management groups and subscriptions cannot be managed by PIM. The correct answer is B. Start with the most critical production resources, even though there is no limit to the number of resources that can be managed. Now, let me explain. This question is about the recommended rollout strategy for PIM on Azure resources. B is correct because the best practice is to begin with the most critical production resources, where a misuse of access would have the greatest business and security impact. Even though PIM can manage resources broadly, the guidance is still to prioritize by risk and importance first. A is incorrect because the recommendation is not to onboard everything at once, and there is not a fixed limit forcing that approach. C is also incorrect because production resources can absolutely be managed by PIM. And in fact, they are often the best place to start when they are most critical. D is incorrect as well because PIM can be used at higher scopes such as management groups and subscriptions, not only on child resources. Therefore, the correct approach is to start with the most critical production resources. Question 60. A security analyst is reviewing sign-in logs and filters the conditional access results to identify events where access requirements were not ultimately met. What does the failure value indicate in this context? Select one answer. A. The sign-in was successful and no conditional access policies were evaluated. B. One or more conditional access policies applied to the user and application, but not necessarily the other conditions. C. The sign-in satisfied the user and application condition of at least one conditional access policy, and grant controls were either not satisfied or set to block access. D. No policy applied to the user and application during sign-in. C. The correct answer is C. The sign-in satisfied the user and application condition of at least one conditional access policy, and grant controls were either not satisfied or set to block access. Now let me explain. This question is about what a conditional access failure result means in sign-in logs. C is correct because it shows that at least one conditional access policy was relevant to the sign-in based on the user and application. However, the required grant controls were not satisfied, or the policy was configured to block access. As a result, the access attempt failed in the conditional access evaluation. A is incorrect because a successful sign-in with no conditional access evaluation does not describe a failure state. B is also incorrect because it only describes that a policy may have been relevant to the user and app, but it does not capture the key point that grant controls failed or access was blocked. D is incorrect as well because if no policy applied to the user and application, that would not represent the conditional access failure outcome being described here.